Thank you so much for joining us today, Secretary Lew. I can't resist asking some questions about liquidity as well, since that's come up several times, but I want to take a different approach as opposed to the required capital standards. I was wondering, in your testimony, you mentioned that it's been a year now since we have floated the NAV for institutional investors, and I was, and your at least your executive summary was not very descriptive of how that's been working. I'm wondering if we have seen less use or about the same of assets which are typically a little bit more liquid than other investments in the money market mutual fund.
Congresswoman, first, the rules I don't believe are effective yet. They were put in final form, but with a future effective date. I think we've seen a continued reduction in the reliance on short-term wholesale funding, which is a good thing. But we still have very large amounts of investment in money market funds. And we saw in the financial crisis that there was run risk there, and the reason that the rules were put in place by the SEC was to create a safer path forward. I certainly will keep an eye on that as it's implemented to make sure it works as designed, but we've made clear that we have to keep attentive to whether or not they are sufficient or whether there's a need for additional policy.
But it would not be a good thing if we were to close down or essentially shut down the money market mutual fund. Or stagnate it in some way, prevent those institutional investors from having that liquidity. That would be something you'd be watching out for.
Right. I mean, the problem is the connection between the money market funds and the rest of the financial system. What we saw during the financial crisis was that the risk of money market investors, institutional investors, leaving, selling their position, was creating the risk that the overnight funding that the largest financial institutions relied on would evaporate. Mm-hmm. And that could have caused the entire implosion of major financial institutions. We're in a much better place because there's less reliance on wholesale funding, and we now have rules in place to try and make it safer.
Thank you, Secretary Lew. You mentioned also that the threat of migration of servicing from banks to non-banks, such as the recently announced algorithmic lending that Goldman Sachs, for example, wants to do, really demonstrate there's a change in market structure, that there's more risk-taking incentives. I'm wondering, in that context, whether or not, how non-bank SIFIs, do you think it's more important to focus on a few industries, fewer institutions, or what do you see? Do you see an expanded role for the FSOC given the change in the market structure?
Look, I think that we have tried to be very careful and analytic in the approach and not to overreach and go into spaces that we don't need to be in or belong in. The institutions that have been identified are market utilities that have cross-cutting exposures, and the largest kinds of firms that are non-bank firms where the determination was made that the risk is there. So it's not that we're looking to regulate more firms for the sake of regulating more firms. We're going to continue to go through the criteria, and we're obviously getting to smaller firms as we get down the list.
Thank you, Secretary Lew. I was stunned at some of your comments to Mr. Cleaver about GSC reform, and also your declaration in your testimony that negative equity has declined. That hasn't been my experience at all, and I think homeowners are in a lurch after this recession. A lot of housing in my district deteriorating because you can't lend for needed improvements in the home. I mean, basic things like roofs, plumbing, and so on. I think we need some sort of product. I only have 10 seconds, so I guess I just want to get your insight about the health of the homeowner in this environment?
So I'd be happy to follow up. I don't have the time, but I have tried in a few instances to express the concern that creditworthy borrowers should have access to the market, and there are a number of things that we're looking at in that regard.
Time in the